Hi, my name is Nayanatara, and I work at this place called the Internet Democracy Project. We basically work in the tech policy space and try to bring a feminist politics of data there without fully knowing what that might mean. And we're still thinking about what is feminist about the work that we do, what should be different, etc. But about 3 years ago, we started doing this research about the relationship between technology, safety, and surveillance. This was because a lot of sorry, मेरा हिंदी थोड़ा bad है, तो I'm really sorry. I would have prepared, but anyway, so yeah, so around 3 years ago, a lot of conversation in the tech policy space was about surveillance, and a lot of people in these rooms were a lot of men and like upper class men talking about surveillance. And we had to think, wait, actually, you are not the experts on surveillance, and it's not something new that is in the digital age. It's not something that the government only does, and it's not, it's not new at all. And there was a kind of flattening that we felt was happening in the policy space. So, so we thought we'd do a project to gender the discussion on surveillance and called it Gendering Surveillance at a later point. Yeah, but what we were thinking was that surveillance was being made out, there was an increasing securitization in society that we were seeing around us, and what it was made out to be was only about if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to lose. It was only about what has happened, as opposed to this also disciplining nature of surveillance, which was never coming out. And this is quite quite an everyday experience for a lot of women. And when I say women, I mean it as a shorthand for gender and sexuality minorities, because it's also true of effeminate men or like anyone else that isn't conforming to this thing considered normative. So just as an example, if you're walking down the street and you're just like having a good time and walking, and you suddenly feel like someone's watching you, you kind of demonstrate purpose by either speaking on the phone or checking if everything's okay. And it might not even be the case that someone's watching you. Even while you leave the house, you probably pick up a jacket in the expectation that someone might, I don't know, in the expectation that you have to perform this kind of person who deserves safety, etc. So this disciplining nature is not something that we theorize or think about in policy spaces, but is really like an everyday experience. So what we wanted to do was do a project where basically it would be academic, but also, I mean, speak to the everyday realities of people and be able to key into the policy space. So we basically used this framework where we wanted to question this idea that technologies were neutral. And this one academic framework that we found very useful was by Torrin Monahan, this academic, where she speaks of 3 ways in which technologies are not neutral. So the first, quickly, is body discrimination. So if you think of airbags in cars, it was found out that after like a long time of use of airbags, it was found out that it was actually not suited for women's bodies, and a lot more deaths were occurring because it was only tested on male bodies as if that was the normative body. And that led to a lot of kinds of, I mean, a disproportionate number of deaths of people that were not this like typical man. A second example of, a second kind of discrimination is a use or context discrimination, where, for example, if you think of CCTV cameras put in apartment buildings, if a married man comes back at 1 a.m. in the night, he probably would not be questioned. But if you're an unmarried young woman who has moved from a different city, then you probably have different consequences to the same technology being in use. And the third is discrimination by abstraction, where basically it's really relevant to these times where a lot of discrimination happens via data, and data is thought of as this disembodied kind of faraway thing, and it doesn't feel as close home as like bodily safety does. Now, of course, this is just like one way to think about it, and I'm sure there's more different kinds of discrimination that technologies bring. But basically, we used this framework to look at 3 case studies. The first was mobile phone bans in different parts in North India. where there were a lot of news reports talking about Khap Panchayats, which were enforcing bans on young women's use of mobile phones. And we wanted to understand where that falls in this spectrum of surveillance/violence that all of us face, because it's not as if city people don't face surveillance from homes, etc. And the second was safety apps and how safety and surveillance is like truly intertwined in many ways. And we were hoping the study on safety apps would bring that out. And the third one was about CCTV cameras in garments factories, because garments factories have a really high number of women employed, and sexual harassment is also very high. So one way that the management was dealing with this problem was by saying, okay, we're now going to have CCTV cameras, and except the data and the devices were controlled by the management. So we learned that it didn't end up having any real impact on the cases of sexual harassment. In fact, it just kind of, for example, if the supervisor knew that the cameras would be switched on at 9:30, he would call a lot of women at 9 o'clock, and like the harassment would take place before. So even knowledge about when it is switched on, like just information about that technology itself kind of centralized so much power in different people. But I want to talk about the second one, which is safety apps. And I think this one? Yeah. So around, we started, after this whole Nirbhaya thing happened, we noticed a lot of different kinds of actors were creating safety apps. And if we looked at the budgets of budgets meant for women's safety, most of them would either go into CCTV cameras or would go into making some kind of app. And this was not just the state actually, but even like, for example, NASSCOM would have an all India app contest on the theme of women's safety, and people would come up with this app. There were a lot of political parties like AAP, BJP that brought their own apps. There were a lot of wearables, which is like the new in thing now, because if you look at the intervening time since we did this research and now what is developed in the area of technology to address violence against women is the sensors have gotten smaller, and they come in like, you can wear a necklace and it can be inserted into your skin. But essentially the basic concept is still that you send an alert. You send an alert and someone comes and saves you. But it was also really funny while doing this research, because I think there were about 8 apps that were called Nirbhaya itself. So one was Nirbhaya, Be Fearless. One more was Be Safe, Be Free. One more was No More Nirbhaya. And so it was just like part of this trend. So we wanted to see when would a safety app actually be empowering and in what situations, and when would it not. And these were kind of the main findings that we had. It's that more than 90% of sexual assault actually happens within homes, and most of these apps were being developed for public spaces and to address a very small number of stranger rapes that in people's eyes have this like exaggerated kind of understanding of. And the second is that they don't really shift any social realities in people's lives, but in fact privatize this burden of having to take care of themselves instead of there being any systemic shifts at all. And it was also like there was so much, this is 3 years ago, and apps, right? You can imagine how bad the interfaces were, but you had to also charge your phone, have data, be in constant vigilance, and kind of like, there was a lot of individualized burden, and which could perhaps lead to victim blaming if you had this app and didn't use it right, etc. And most importantly for us, it was also that women's safety was becoming this very friendly, nice vehicle in which to package a lot of surveillance policy decisions by the government. So something like, I think compulsory panic buttons came about at city levels, at like even Menaka Gandhi announced it. I don't think it's still, like, it changed hardware being developed itself, but I don't know if actually people use it, and there's no data about that. But not only was it leading to tracking of entire populations and normalizing that, but in fact it made that obligatory. So all phone manufacturers had to have this one button, etc. Nonetheless, these apps started to, were still proliferating all the same. So we wanted to understand what was working and what was not. So we basically, just one second. I'm very sorry. Yeah, so we basically looked at different safety apps. I think we took 50 of them, depending on which of them were most commonly mentioned in different listicles. And we looked at 3 things. One is background info features, the second is privacy policy, and the third is accessibility. Now we looked at who the app was made by, who the developers were, because they're often different entities, whether it's Indian or not, and why it's popular in the Indian market, what language that these apps use, the number of downloads, the tracking type, which I'll get to. Okay, actually the rest of it I think I'll have to explain. But basically we tried to categorize these things, these apps into different types, so to speak, so that we understand what are the different kinds of features in them. Okay, I'm going to go super fast on this. So basically, we found that there were a couple of types of tracking. First was tracking upon alert, where you have, where you when you send an alert, and after that, someone, either your family member or someone else, basically gets that alert and comes and like tries to help. The second type is constant tracking, where basically someone is at all times able to figure out where you are. And the third was geofencing, where basically I can say that if this person leaves GK2, then I should get an alert. And the fourth was heat maps, which is crowdsourced information about the safety of areas, which is also the thing that Safetipin does. And the other thing that we looked at were where do these alerts go? So like one is I can predetermine who the user is. I can say like this friend of mine it should go to. The second was known third party, which is someone like the police or some call center who's dedicated to doing this. And the third was network publics. It would actually post on your Facebook saying, help me, I'm in trouble, etc., or a combination of these. Now, all of these were like problematic for different reasons for us, and only one of these didn't involve being dependent on others, and that was heat maps. Features like Walk With Me might be useful for people with autonomy, but it was also dangerous for those living within super, mobility limiting conditions, etc. And there were also like additional info that would be sent, like audio or video when you sent alerts. So it was also dangerous then, like it was also important to know when there are false positives. So a lot of times these apps say that shake it to send an alert, or like pull the headphones to send an alert, etc. And it was quite common that these would happen without actually an alert being sent. Where do the alerts go? So these also had a bunch of problems because there's always power relations between all the actors that are involved. And if you're a certain kind of woman, you probably can expect a certain kind of safety from the police, as opposed to if you were, doing things that they would consider questionable. And I think, so around this time, Google also put this thing out called Trusted Contacts. It wasn't actually targeted at women, but if the targeted sorry, I'm just scared that I don't have no time. So basically, if I can request for someone's user, some user's location if I'm scared that they're in trouble, and if they don't respond, then I automatically get that person's location. So that, like, lots of these problematic things that didn't think about the context in which these things would be used. But I guess the point I have to make is one over here, that this research was done 2 years ago. And I think we had some of the same critiques that came up earlier today about Safetipin. But what I would say 2 years hence is it's also important to think which of these apps have actually, like our critique was also this question about the claim to accuracy, and I know that that's not the claim that Safetipin has, but it's also about this reproductive labor that is behind maintenance, which most of these apps actually don't have. They kind of have this launch, and then someone's cutting some ribbon somewhere. There is a lot of like PR around that, and that's it. And it's actually like funny that most of these apps that we looked at no longer exist or function, etc. So in that sense, I guess there has been, I mean, I just wanted to say that our thinking has, of course, shifted since we did this study also. And yeah, I guess the last point I'll make and stop is on the privacy policy. So basically, we also looked at how safe are you when data about you is not safe? Because most of these apps did not have a privacy policy. 32 out of 50 apps did not have a privacy policy. Even where they had these policies, it would outrightly say that your information would be used for analytics to do e-commerce, blah, 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 etc. E-commerce, credit scoring, etc. And also it's important that GPS information, location information is something that is so lucrative and so important in the data market. And this was a great way of getting large sections GPS information. And like, you could say that all apps collected that information at that point of time, or arguably even now. So how do you hold this to a different standard? But I think it is different when there is a claim being made about it being a safety app. Yeah, and to that extent, I think it is disingenuous. And I'll just end with this infographic, which is what happens to your data. Is it processed? Is it stored? Is it sold? None of that is disclosed. Yeah, I guess I covered the rest of it. So yes, that was kind of it.